You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. China has slapped the tariffs of up to 25% of 128 U.S. products, including frozen pork, wine, and fruit. The decision made by the Customs Tariffs Commission of the State Council took effect on Monday. Before we discuss the impact of the recent trade frictions with our panelists from all over the world, take a look at this first.
In response to American tariffs on imported Chinese aluminum and steel, China has decided to impose a tariff of 15% on 120 U.S. products, ranging from nuts to steel pipes, and a tariff of 25% on 8 other U.S. products, including pork and scrap aluminum.
I think the scope of tariffs is still limited. It fails to touch the main nerves of America, as most of the items are agricultural products from small-scale production. In fact, China imports nearly 1/3 of its soybeans. If China levies tariffs on imports of its soybeans, that would give much pressure to the U.S. government and may affect the Republicans' midterm election.
Despite worldwide objections, the U.S. decided in early March to impose a 25% tariff on steel imports and a 10% tariff on aluminum. The measure went into effect on March 23rd. The Chinese government says the move violates World Trade Organization rules and causes serious damage to its interests. In specific terms, China's Commerce Ministry says the American tariffs have abused the security exception clause of the WTO. It urges Washington to end the tariffs and restore normal bilateral trade relations. Experts believe that it's impossible for China and the U.S. to root out all the factors leading up to the imbalanced trade pattern. But it is possible to take concrete measures to prevent it from going in the wrong direction.
The U.S.-China trade friction, a bump in the road or a long way to go? That is really the question. Let's turn to our panelists. We have a very strong panel with us here in Beijing. Professor Zhang Jianping, Director General of the Center for Regional Cooperation with Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. That's a long title, but good to see you, sir. Yeah. And also joining us in Beijing, William Zarrett, first time on our show, Chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce here in China, here to brief us about the business attitude toward this. Thank you so much, Will, for being with us. In Washington, D.C., David Dollar, Senior Fellow with the Foreign Policy and Global Economy and Development Program with the John Thornton China Center, Brookings Institution. Good to see you, Mr. Dollar. And in Hong Kong, last but not least, we have Dr. Fred Hu, Chairman and Founder of Primavera Capital Group. That's a China-based global investment firm. Welcome as well. Let me begin with the two of you sitting in the Beijing studio. So, are we looking at another stage leading us to the trade war, or we have hope that things can be settled? Mr. Zarrett, your assessment.
We have too much at stake, both sides, to actually have a full-blown, what we call, trade war. I think that both sides are now starting to talk to each other, and to the extent that they can work this out without going too much further, I think we will work it out. It's not guaranteed, but I'm hoping that they will.
Can we do it soon, or it has to take quite a while and quite some drama?
Well, I'd have to speculate here. I think there's going to be more drama. My sense is with the President of the United States, he is quite unpredictable, which is sometimes an advantage, but in this case, maybe not an advantage, especially for our Chinese friends. It's hard to say. My gut tells me we're going to have a little more drama before we have resolution.
What about you, Mr. Zhang? Your assessment?
My sense is that right now we just can say this is a trade friction between two biggest economies. Regarding trade war, you know that war means that U.S. side fight China, one time, and China respond one time, and then followed another time, and the scale, that the trade volume scale and money, bigger and bigger, and then that means trade war. So I deeply worry about right now the trade friction, and maybe tend to be trade war soon.
Yeah.
So from Chinese side, our attitude is that we hope U.S. side can keep rational attitude and be careful to use this type of measures in order to avoid potential trade war.
Mr. Dollar, in Washington, China has already published a list of the tariffs on the kinds of products. Among the list, fried fruits, apples, and some of the farm products, pork as well. Will this, in a way, remind the Trump administration of China's attitude, not willing to go to the war, but at the same time, very firm attitude in a way? Mr. Dollar?
China historically has always responded to trade measures with retaliation. So I think this is a clear signal from the Chinese government. It's typical with the history. U.S. has imposed some pretty large tariffs on steel and aluminum. The Chinese response is modest. So while it's 128 products, it adds up to a pretty small amount of trade, I think about $3 billion. But it is carefully targeted at different parts of the country, mostly at farmers. So it's a reminder to the United States that the U.S. exports a lot of farm goods to China. And if this escalates, then American farmers are really going to get hurt.
20 billion China is importing agricultural products, the latest I check, from the United States. So this one is still a small portion, but things could go further than this. Mr. Hu, we understand the trade representative coming from the U.S., Mr. Lighthizer, is likely, I'm using the word likely, to come up with the list to quote unquote punish China when it comes to the tariffs against further Chinese goods. So on Friday, that is. So do you think the U.S. would, in a way, assess the current situation well, and while at the same time doing it in a constructive way? Mr. Hu?
I think it's too early to tell. I think the dynamics such. I'm afraid we could expect much more drastic actions out of Washington. So this whole bilateral trade relationship, has the potential to get much worse before we see any signs of getting better.
Interesting.
Okay, it seems that all have expressed the, shall I say, cautious attitude, all of you, the four of you, whether China or the United States, the scholars that we talked to. So, Mr. Zarek, help us to understand how it works. Friday, people say it could be a big day. The list comes out from the U.S. side. What are the signs, do you think, if there were any list coming out, that people should look in order to get the real nature of that list? Secondly, and what exactly is the procedure coming from the U.S. side in terms of setting its own quote-unquote agenda? Mr. Zarek.
Well, I understand that once a list does come out, and I've heard that we're expecting it by Friday, a list, if that's the case, then we have 60 days, according to U.S. law, that we will be open for public comment. And I expect that a lot of public comment will come from perhaps farm associations, as David mentioned. The agricultural sector in the U.S. can be affected, and other sectors that may be affected. So remember, we've got 60 days, and I think that is a good amount of time for the two sides to perhaps come to some meeting of the minds. Just remember one thing. $600+ billion in two-way trade,
That's right.
$500 billion in two-way investment. We've got so much at stake, and that's why I am somewhat optimistic.
But, Mr. Dollar, the president, you said to me the other day, had a lot of power when it comes to trade policies. I mean, the president sitting in the White House right now. So even though Mr. Zarek, for example, together with the American Business Committee here in China, expressed their opinions to some direction, will it have any much impact on the current president, given what Mr. Zarek also said, the unpredictability of the current one sitting in the White House? Mr. Dollar.
I think all of the speakers on your panel are cautiously optimistic, but we're all emphasizing that there's a lot of uncertainty. And that's partly because the President of the United States does have tremendous authority when it comes to tariffs. So as Bill said, there'll be a 60-day comment period. There'll be a lot of voices suggesting that we don't want to have a full-scale trade war with China. But it's really hard to predict what the President of the United States is going to do. So that's really the big question mark hanging over all of this right now.
Fred Hu, what do you think?
Yeah, so again, I agree with the David and the Bill as well. I think there's tremendous uncertainty in the near term. So a lot obviously depends on what the Trump administration is going to do. What they're going to announce exactly on Friday. The scope, the intensity, the severity, and all that. But I think to some degree that also depends on how China is going to respond to that. So, there's a fair amount of consensus clearly, in China that, the Trump administration is aggressively, disruptively unilateralist, and has in fact caused consternation, not just in China, but around the world among all the trading partners, including the U.S. Allies. Having said that, China should be realistic, not to expect, that China can be on a high moral ground. So we have to be very careful how we respond. Respond with the reason, with the with the restraint, not just because obviously it's it can be indignant, like to see this kind of tariffs and the punitive measures imposed on China by Washington. But let's be very clear: no one will win from a trade war.
That is very clear.
That is
very clear, Fred. As you just said, we have heard, Mr. Zhang, today already some of the state leaders from different economies, particularly smaller and medium-sized economies, speaking out. For example, the New Zealand Prime Minister, the female Prime Minister, talking about for small economies like New Zealand, the rule-based mechanism is very important. She is obviously referring to how countries and economy resolve conflicts when it comes to trade, WTO, and also other regional mechanisms. So obviously, China could not rely on being on the higher moral ground in order to solve the problem. But the thing is, this trade conflict, Mr. Zhang, some say is likely to set a precedence about how the current reality of economies going to deal with trade issues. Also, it will set a precedence about how economy these days will respect or not international rules.
In this regard, that actually 301 investigation that's violated, WTO rules and regulations. From Chinese side, we already expressed our, attitude on that. Also, we hope that U.S. could be back on the, WTO rules. I noticed that U.S. Provided their suitcase, provided their report to WTO. But the problem is that without WTO arbitrary, and the U.S. already provided solutions. So that's very strange things. So in this regard, I don't think that this is a constructive attitude. Another thing is that actually 301. I do believe that Trump administration will do something. They will have high tariff measures for those Chinese goods. Also, the U.S. side expressed their concerns on China's high-tech sector's development, but I think that that's the U.S. domination and their the America first, this type of doing. That China is another country. We also have right to promote our high-tech sector development. We should compete in international market.
Mr. Zarid is having a smile on his face. Obviously, he's having some different opinions in the polite way. Is that what you're trying to say here, Mr.
I'm
Zarid?
just saying that, Dr. Zhang, there were a lot of different points, very thorough, talking about a lot of different issues. One, WTO. And I think what I understand the Trump administration looking at WTO, there is a long list of cases And I'll just mention the electronic payment services for one, where WTO decided in favor of the U.S. 6 years ago, and nothing has happened to open up that market. That's just one example. So I think we need a rules-based organization. I think it needs to be revised in order to have better enforcement. And of course now...
Revised, you're saying now we're revising the WTO rules? Or
No,
what
I think
are
they
we
should
saying?
be.
Okay.
I think they should be. How should we have to wait 6 years for China to act on a decision by the WTO?
So you're saying what Trump is now doing against China is about revising the WTO rules? Is that what you're saying?
That's not what I'm saying.
All right then.
I'm just saying that should
actually,
be done.
sorry. Actually, I'm afraid that Trump said that thinks that China's entry WTO, that agreement should be revised. Okay. If that agreement needs to be revised, that means we need to have a new round of negotiations instead of trade frictions, instead of unfair higher tariffs.
All right, let's give the other two gentlemen some airtime too. Mr. Dollar, you've been listening attentively to your colleague here in Beijing. Tell me about what would the current list, if there was any list coming from the U.S. side, punish? Is it going to punish, quote unquote, the Chinese businesses in the United States? Or is it going to punish the American businesses more in China? Is that the best way to bring, quote unquote, the American businesses back home? Mr. Dollar.
Right. So the U.S. faces a dilemma in that a lot of the concern is about high-tech industries. And just listening to that conversation, the U.S. has a lot of legitimate complaints about market access issues in China. There are a lot of high-tech sectors, service sectors where U.S. firms are not allowed to invest. So I think the U.S. has a lot of legitimate frustrations. I don't agree with the way the administration is pursuing this. As they look to hit China with tariffs, they face this dilemma that it makes sense to go after some of the high-tech sectors given their concern, but those are exactly the sectors where China's exports to the U.S. really have only a small amount of Chinese value added, and those sectors rely a lot on foreign value added. So American firms are very invested in that, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Germany. So if the U.S. goes after the high-tech products, there's going to be a lot of collateral damage to other firms. They're going to be third parties who get hurt.
Okay.
On the other hand, if the U.S. wants to go after sectors where it's mostly Chinese value added, those are old sectors like footwear and garments. So that's the dilemma the U.S. faces.
And China is also trying to restructure its economy, moving a bit away from the footwear and the garment side. But anyway, before Fred talks, I want to give Mr. Zarit another time because you and your colleagues at the American Chamber of Commerce, I'm sure you're discussing this every day and probably every hour. So your businesses here in China, your members, are going to have a direct impact as a result of all these tariffs, Mrs. Zarit.
Some will, some won't. Most companies are concerned. We have 900 company members. I think we have about 899 different opinions about the way things should be.
Good for you as a chairman.
But we do have a consensus, and we have asked our members, what would you like the U.S. government to do to help? And the first thing was to advocate for a level playing field. The second thing, to advocate for reciprocal treatment and better market access. Now, does that mean tariffs? I know we're talking about tariffs, we're getting into the weeds on tariffs. Our membership does not think tariffs is the best way to go.
But the thing is, how much say does the U.S. business community have on the current White House and the Capitol Hill?
I think the business community...
Do you guys still make any impact back in Washington? We do.
And actually, for the past several years, we've been going back to Washington and saying, we need a level playing field. We are looking for reciprocal treatment, a relationship based on fairness. And finally, Washington said, oh, okay, but we don't think tariffs is really the effective way to go.
All right. Which Washington you were talking about? Was it the Obama Washington or the Trump Washington, Mr. Zarit?
Actually, both.
Okay, there we go. Mr. Hu, let's go to you about that. Obviously, it is not just the Chinese business going to be impacted. So what are we talking about here? And the thing is, how can we drag all the things back to logic, back to negotiation, back to real good discussion of quality rather than just shouting to one another in a way across the Pacific? Fred, I give you a very hard question. Go ahead.
Right. So first of all, I think the tariff reimposing any kind of trade barrier is the unproductive approach. Is going to make a matter worse. For Chinese in particular, I think while we feel very frustrated about Washington's trade stance, but we should also be cool-headed to really listen, to be good listener. Your side may have some legitimate concern about our trade practice. Let's say, for me, clearly since China's accession to WTO, China has made huge strides in opening up the economy and the markets and the industries, and that's why we have so many. We just had like 900 U.S. companies operating in China, right? So that's a huge sign of China today is far more open than it was ever before. On the other hand, the bar is much higher. China is not just ordinary, middle income developing country. I think U.S., Japan, and the European Union expect China to be more like developed country in terms of openness, in terms of level playing field. So I think we have to also reflect where we can do better in terms of market opening, in terms of intellectual property rights, so that we can address some of the concerns in a very peaceful, productive way, without having to resort for full-blown trading war.
Got your point. Let's take a look before we go to how should China move ahead to the next stage. Back at some of the events that have led to the current stand-up. We have a timeline here.
Last year, the U.S. began the 301 investigations targeting China's alleged intellectual property and technology transfer scheme. In January, President Trump announced duties on imports of solar panels and washing machines. Last month, Trump continued the announcements with tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% for aluminum. In response to the move, Premier Li Keqiang said China does not want a trade war with the U.S. But 2 days later, the U.S. president announced new tariffs on up to $60 billion worth of Chinese imports, citing the results of the 301 investigations. After repeatedly calling for talks, China has hit back with tariffs of up to 25% on 128 U.S. products in response to U.S. duties on steel and aluminum.
That are the major events that happened over the past few days and weeks. Now we only have less than 2 minutes left. I want to have 20 seconds from every one of you gentlemen. Where is China and how China be reasonable, the logic, and bring the other parties back to the right thing? Let's go to Fred first. 20 seconds, sir.
Yeah, let's sit down, let's talk. Let's also move aggressively with our internal economic reform and the market reform, so that we can be credible defender of globalization.
All right, Mr. Zarek.
Yeah, I agree with Fred. I also think we need to focus on innovation. It's very important for China. Innovation, what's the best way to innovate? Global innovation. Innovation is not in a vacuum. Standards, IPR, and data flows across borders.
Got your point. A lot of keywords over there. And Mr. Dollar, 20 seconds. My producer is telling me time is running out.
China should create its own reform plan. China should develop its own plan for opening up, very aggressively opening up, and implement it and not get distracted by the United States.
Good point there. Mr. Zhang, final words.
The U.S. should be back on framework of WTO. Meanwhile, China is ready to fight with 301 investigation.
Zhang Jianping, William Zarek, David Dollar, and Fred Hu. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. We have laughter in the talk, even when it comes to the trade, so-called the trade war. But thank you, all making reasonable and important comments. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us.